Welcome to the world of science function. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy the listening. The metallic hum of the starship faded into silence as the transport shuttle docked with the orbital prison ship. This was no ordinary vessel, it was a fortress, a testament to humanity's ingenuity and cruelty. Inside, the air was thick with tension as the ship prepared to drop its most recent cargo onto Deathworld Prime, a planet so hostile it had earned the dubious honor of being the galaxy's ultimate dumping ground for prisoners. James, a former engineer turned convicted rebel, sat shackled to the cold steel bench inside the shuttle. His sharp brown eyes scanned the room, taking in the defeated faces of the other prisoners. Each bore the scars of battles fought and lost, their stories etched into their hardened expressions. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. Deathworld Prime was notorious for its savage storms, carnivorous flora, and apex predators that made even the galaxy's most dangerous creatures look tame. Surviving here was less about skill and more about sheer, unrelenting will. But James wasn't about to give up just yet. Beside him sat Siri, a biologist who had been caught smuggling classified research on genetic mutations. Her hazel eyes darted nervously around the cabin, her fingers twitching as if itching to grasp a data pad. Siri wasn't built for combat or survival. Her strength lay in her mind, in her ability to see patterns and connections others missed. She glanced at James, her voice a whisper. "You're awfully calm for someone about to be dropped into the galaxy's deadliest hellhole." James smirked, the corner of his lips curling into a defiant grin. "Calm? Hardly. I just know panic won't help. Besides," he added, lowering his voice, "they forgot one thing." Siri raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. Before she could press him further, the shuttle jolted violently, signaling their descent. The artificial gravity struggled to compensate, and several prisoners cursed loudly as they were thrown against their restraints. James remained silent, his grin replaced by a steely determination. As the shuttle pierced the planet's thick atmosphere, the viewports revealed a landscape that seemed to be pulled from a nightmare. Towering mountains of obsidian rock loomed over dense jungles teeming with bioluminescent plants. Rivers of molten lava carved paths through the terrain, their fiery glow a stark contrast to the eerie, perpetual twilight that bathed the planet. Deathworld Prime was alive, and it was hungry. The shuttle touched down with a deafening crash, its landing anything but smooth. The prisoners were unshackled and herded out by robotic guards, their metallic voices barking commands. As James stepped onto the planet's surface, the air hit him like a wall, dense, humid, and laced with the acrid scent of sulfur. Around him, the other prisoners huddled together, their fear palpable. Siri stood close to James, her face pale but resolute. A booming voice echoed from the shuttle's speakers. "Welcome to Deathworld Prime. Survive, if you can. There are no rules, no rescue missions, and no mercy. You are on your own." With that, the shuttle's engines roared to life, and it lifted off, leaving the prisoners stranded. James watched it disappear into the murky sky, his jaw tightening. He turned to Siri, who was clutching a small satchel containing what little equipment she'd been allowed to keep. "Stay close," he said. "This place isn't just dangerous, it's alive." The group had barely taken a few steps when the first signs of the planet's hostility made themselves known. A low growl rumbled through the jungle, followed by the snapping of branches. The prisoners froze, their eyes darting towards the source of the sound. From the shadows emerged a creature that defied logic, a six-legged predator with scales that shimmered like oil and eyes that glowed an unnatural green. Its jaws opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Panic erupted. Some prisoners ran, scattering into the jungle, while others froze in terror. James grabbed Siri's arm and pulled her behind a nearby rock formation. "Don't move," he whispered. "It's drawn to movement." The creature stalked closer, its massive body moving with a predatory grace. James's mind raced. They were unarmed, unprepared, and utterly outmatched. But he wasn't ready to die, not yet. His eyes scanned the area, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon or distraction. His gaze landed on a cluster of bioluminescent plants, their glow pulsing rhythmically. An idea formed. "Siri," he whispered, "those plants. Do they emit a scent or some kind of chemical?" Siri followed his gaze, her mind clicking into analytical mode despite the danger. "Yes," she whispered back. "Their glow suggests they release a pheromone to attract pollinators." "Perfect," James said, a hint of his earlier grin returning. "We're going to use them as bait." Siri hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Together, they crawled towards the plants, careful not to draw the creature's attention. James yanked one from the ground, its stem oozing a sticky, fluorescent sap. He turned and hurled it as far as he could, the plant landing with a wet splat several meters away. The creature's head snapped towards the sound, its nostrils flaring as it caught the scent. It let out a guttural snarl and lunged towards the glowing plant, tearing into it with ferocious abandon. James didn't wait to see the outcome. He grabbed Siri's hand and bolted, leading her deeper into the jungle. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs threatened to give out. Finally, they collapsed in a small clearing, the distant sounds of the creature's growls fading into the background. Siri looked at James, her chest heaving. "You're insane." "Maybe," James admitted, his grin returning. "But we're alive." As the adrenaline subsided, the reality of their situation set in. They were on a planet designed to kill, with no resources and no allies. But James wasn't about to let that stop him. He glanced at Siri, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "They may have dropped us here to die," he said, his voice steady. "But they forgot one thing." Siri tilted her head, waiting. "They forgot we're human," James said, his grin widening. "And humans are damn good at surviving." For the first time, Siri smiled. It was small and fleeting, but it was enough. Together, they began to plan, their minds racing with possibilities. Deathworld Prime was a nightmare, but it was also a challenge James and Siri intended to win. The jungle seemed to close in around them, its dense canopy blocking out what little light filtered through the planet's perpetual twilight. The bioluminescent plants that dotted the landscape pulsed with an almost hypnotic rhythm, their glow casting eerie shadows on the ground. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every distant screech, set James and Siri on edge. Deathworld Prime wasn't just a planet, it was a predator, and they were its prey. "We need to keep moving," James said, his voice low. He scanned their surroundings, his eyes darting to every movement in the underbrush. "Staying in one place makes us easy targets." Siri nodded, clutching her satchel tightly. "Agreed. But where do we go? We have no map, no supplies, and no idea what's out there." "We'll figure it out," James replied, though his confidence was more for her benefit than his own. He had no idea how they were going to survive, let alone escape, but he wasn't about to let despair take hold. Not yet. As they moved cautiously through the jungle, the ground beneath their feet began to change. The soft, mossy terrain gave way to a hard, cracked surface that shimmered with a faint metallic sheen. Siri knelt down, her curiosity piqued despite their dire situation. "This isn't natural," she murmured, running her fingers over the surface. "It's some kind of alloy." James crouched beside her, his brow furrowing. "A structure, maybe? Buried under the surface?" "Possibly," Siri said, standing up and brushing her hands off. "But why would anyone build something here, of all places?" "Maybe the same reason they dropped us here," James said grimly. "Whatever that reason is." Their conversation was cut short by a sudden, high-pitched screech that pierced the air. Both of them froze, their eyes snapping towards the source of the sound. A group of prisoners came stumbling into view, their faces pale and their movements frantic. Behind them, the jungle erupted in chaos as another of the planet's predators burst through the underbrush. This one was even more terrifying than the first, a massive, insectoid creature with razor-sharp mandibles and a segmented body that shimmered like liquid metal. It moved with unnerving speed, its multiple legs slicing through the undergrowth as it closed in on its prey. "Run!" one of the prisoners screamed, his voice breaking with panic. James didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing Siri's arm, he pulled her into a sprint, their hearts pounding as they raced to escape the nightmare behind them. The prisoners scattered, their panicked cries echoing through the jungle, but it was clear the creature had locked onto its targets. One by one, it picked them off, its mandibles snapping with sickening efficiency. James and Siri burst into a clearing, their breaths ragged. "Over there!" Siri shouted, pointing to a cluster of jagged rocks that jutted out of the ground like the spines of some ancient beast. Without hesitation, they dove behind the rocks, pressing themselves against the cool surface as the sounds of the creature's rampage grew closer. James peered around the edge of the rock, his heart sinking as he saw the creature emerging from the jungle. It paused, its antennae twitching as it scanned the clearing. James's mind raced. They needed a distraction, something to draw the creature's attention away from their hiding spot. Siri's hand brushed against the satchel at her side, and an idea struck her. She pulled out a small vial filled with a bright, viscous liquid. "This is a pheromone I was working on," she whispered. "It's designed to attract certain types of insects." James's eyes widened. "You think it'll work on that thing?" "I have no idea," Siri admitted. "But it's our best shot." With a deep breath, she uncorked the vial and tossed it as far as she could. The glass shattered against a nearby tree, and almost instantly, the air was filled with a sickly sweet aroma. The creature's head snapped towards the source of the scent, its antennae vibrating wildly. With a screech, it charged towards the tree, its mandibles slicing through the trunk as it searched for its phantom prey. "Let's move," James whispered, motioning for Siri to follow him. They slipped away from the rocks, their movements as silent as they could manage. As they disappeared back into the jungle, the creature's enraged screeches faded into the distance. Once they were sure they were safe, they collapsed onto the ground, their bodies trembling from the adrenaline. Siri looked at James, her chest heaving. "I can't believe that worked." "Me neither," James admitted, a shaky laugh escaping his lips. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Siri managed a small smile. "Let's just hope I've got a few more surprises left." Their moment of relief was short-lived. As they caught their breath, they became aware of a faint, rhythmic vibration in the ground. It grew stronger with each passing second, accompanied by a low, mechanical hum. James frowned, his instincts screaming that something was very wrong. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Siri nodded, her expression tense. "It's coming from below us." Before they could react, the ground beneath them gave way. They tumbled into darkness, their screams swallowed by the void. When they hit the bottom, the impact knocked the wind out of them, but miraculously, neither was seriously injured. They found themselves in a massive, underground chamber, its walls lined with strange, glowing symbols that pulsed with an otherworldly light. "What is this place?" Siri whispered, her voice tinged with awe and fear. James pushed himself to his feet, his eyes scanning the chamber. "I don't know," he said, his voice grim. "But I have a feeling we just found out why they sent us here." The mechanical hum grew louder, and the symbols on the walls began to shift, rearranging themselves into patterns that seemed almost alive. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the chamber, speaking in a language neither of them could understand. James and Siri exchanged a glance, their fear momentarily eclipsed by a shared determination. Whatever this place was, it held the key to their survival or their doom. And they weren't about to give up without a fight. The chamber's pulsing lights cast shifting shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere that felt alive, as if the space itself was watching. James stood still, his breathing shallow, as the deep, resonant voice filled the cavern. Beside him, Siri's eyes darted across the glowing symbols on the walls, her mind racing to make sense of them. "We need to figure out what this place is," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "If they sent us here, there has to be a reason." James nodded, though his instincts screamed at him to keep moving. "Agreed, but let's not stick around too long. This place doesn't feel friendly." As if in response to his words, the symbols on the walls began to shift more rapidly, their glow intensifying. The ground beneath them vibrated, and a series of low mechanical clicks echoed through the chamber. Suddenly, a portion of the wall slid open, revealing a passageway lined with the same glowing symbols. "Do we have a choice?" Siri asked, her voice tight. James glanced back at the hole they had fallen through, now far out of reach. "Not really." With cautious steps, they entered the passageway. The air grew colder, and the glow of the symbols cast an eerie light on their faces. The hum of unseen machinery grew louder with each step, and James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded, like prey into a trap. The passageway opened into another chamber, this one even larger than the first. At its center stood a massive structure that resembled a throne, but it was made of twisted metal and pulsating organic material. Wires snaked across the floor, converging at the base of the throne, which hummed with an energy that made the hairs on James's arms stand on end. Before they could fully process the sight, the deep voice returned, this time louder and clearer. The language was still alien, but its tone carried an undeniable sense of authority. As it spoke, the air in front of the throne shimmered, and a figure began to materialize. It was humanoid but impossibly tall, its form composed of the same bioluminescent material as the symbols on the walls. Its face was featureless, save for two glowing orbs where eyes should have been. The voice emanated from the figure, and though the words were incomprehensible, the weight of its presence was enough to make James and Siri instinctively back away. "What is that?" Siri whispered, her voice barely audible. James shook his head. "I don't know. But I don't think it's happy to see us." The figure raised a hand, and the symbols on the walls flared brightly. The ground trembled, and James felt a sudden pressure in his chest, as if the air itself was trying to crush him. He dropped to one knee, his teeth gritted against the invisible force. Siri, too, was struggling to stay upright. But even as she gasped for breath, her analytical mind was working. "It's testing us," she managed to say. "It wants to see if we're worthy." "Worthy of what?" James growled, his voice strained. Before Siri could respond, the pressure abruptly vanished, leaving them both gasping for air. The figure lowered its hand, and the voice spoke again, this time with a note of curiosity. The glowing orbs that served as its eyes fixed on James and Siri, as if studying them. James pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking. "If it wants a test," he said, his voice defiant, "then let's give it one." The figure seemed to understand. It extended its other hand, and the ground around the throne shifted, revealing a series of platforms that floated several feet above the floor. Each platform was marked with symbols that glowed faintly, their patterns constantly changing. "It's a puzzle," Siri said, her voice tinged with both fear and excitement. "Some kind of logic challenge." James frowned. "Great. Because logic puzzles are exactly what we need when we're fighting for our lives." Siri ignored his sarcasm and stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the platforms. "The symbols, their coordinates," she said, her voice growing more confident. "It's mapping a path. We just have to figure out the sequence." "And what happens if we get it wrong?" James asked. As if to answer his question, one of the platforms emitted a sharp crackle of energy, and a burst of light scorched the floor. James raised an eyebrow. "Right. No pressure." Together, they studied the symbols, their minds racing to decipher the patterns. Siri's background in biology gave her an edge, she was used to analyzing complex systems and finding connections. James, for his part, relied on his instincts and mechanical knowledge to spot inconsistencies. "It's this one," Siri said, pointing to a platform. "I'm sure of it." James hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the platform. It held firm, the symbols glowing brighter in what seemed to be acknowledgement. "One down," he said, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Your turn." Siri stepped onto the next platform, her heart pounding. When it, too, held firm, she allowed herself a small smile. "We're getting the hang of this." But as they progressed, the patterns grew more complex, the intervals between symbols shorter. The room seemed to react to their every move, the glowing figure watching with an intensity that was almost palpable. When James hesitated for a fraction of a second too long, the platform he was on began to crackle with energy. "Move!" Siri shouted, and James leaped to the next platform just as a bolt of light struck where he had been standing. He landed hard, his knees buckling, but he managed to stay upright. "Okay," he said, his voice breathless. "This just got a lot less fun." They pressed on, their movements growing more fluid as they adapted to the puzzle's rhythm. With each correct step, the room's energy seemed to shift, the glowing figure nodding almost imperceptibly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the last platform. The throne flared with light, and the figure raised its hands in what seemed to be a gesture of approval. The symbols on the walls began to rearrange themselves, forming a new pattern that spiraled towards the throne. The voice spoke again, and this time, the meaning was clear. "Prove yourselves worthy of life." Before they could react, the room plunged into darkness. When the lights returned, they were no longer in the chamber. Instead, they stood in a dense jungle, the sounds of Deathworld Prime's predators echoing around them. James clenched his fists. "Looks like the test isn't over." Siri glanced at him, her expression grim but determined. "No," she said. "But we just passed the first one. And now we know one thing for sure." "What's that?" James asked. Siri's eyes gleamed. "We weren't sent here to die. We were sent here to evolve." The jungle came alive with a deafening cacophony of sounds, predators snarling in the distance, alien insects buzzing in the humid air, and the constant rustle of leaves as unseen creatures moved through the shadows. James and Siri stood back to back, their breathing heavy and their senses on high alert. They had survived the chamber's trials, but the game wasn't over. Deathworld Prime was testing them, and the stakes had never been higher. James adjusted his grip on the makeshift spear he had fashioned from a fallen branch and a shard of rock. "Whatever this is," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air, "it's not going to let us walk away without one hell of a fight." Siri tightened her hold on the satchel slung over her shoulder. It contained the last remnants of the supplies they had managed to salvage, including a few vials of her experimental pheromones. "We've come this far," she said, her tone resolute. "We're not stopping now." A sudden roar tore through the jungle, closer this time, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Trees toppled as something massive pushed its way through the dense foliage. The creature that emerged was unlike anything they had faced before, a towering beast with scaled, armor-like skin, for glowing eyes, and a pair of massive horns that crackled with energy. It exuded raw power, and its presence sent a clear message: this was the final test. James swallowed hard, his instincts screaming at him to run. But there was nowhere to go, and even if there had been, he knew it would only delay the inevitable. "This thing isn't just a predator," he said, his voice low. "It's the apex predator. And it knows we're here," Siri added, her eyes fixed on the beast as it sniffed the air, its glowing eyes locking onto them. The creature let out another roar, the force of it nearly knocking them off their feet. James and Siri exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They couldn't run, and they couldn't hide. If they were going to survive, they would have to fight. James took a step forward, his spear raised. "I'll distract it," he said. "You figure out how to take it down." Siri grabbed his arm, her expression fierce. "We do this together," she said firmly. "If you're going out there, I'm coming with you." Before James could protest, the creature charged, its massive body shaking the ground with each thunderous step. James and Siri dove in opposite directions, narrowly avoiding the beast's horns as it barreled past. It skidded to a halt and turned, its glowing eyes narrowing as it prepared for another attack. Siri's mind raced as she scanned their surroundings. The jungle was teeming with life, and she knew that Deathworld Prime's ecosystem was interconnected in ways that could either help or destroy them. Her eyes landed on a cluster of bright red flowers growing near the base of a tree. They looked similar to the bioluminescent plants they had encountered earlier, but their glow was more intense, almost pulsating. "Siri!" James shouted, snapping her out of her thoughts. The creature was charging again, its focus locked on him. He dodged to the side, jabbing at its flank with his spear. The weapon barely scratched the creature's armored hide, but it was enough to get its attention. Ciri grabbed a handful of the red flowers, crushing them in her hands and releasing a thick, pungent sap. "James, keep it busy," she called, her voice carrying over the chaos. "Not a problem," James shouted back, ducking under a swipe from the creature's massive tail. He lunged forward, aiming for the softer flesh beneath its jaw. His spear struck home, and the creature let out a furious roar, rearing back on its hind legs. Ciri worked quickly, mixing the sap with one of her pheromone vials. The combination produced a noxious cloud that swirled around her hands, the smell so strong it made her eyes water. "Let's see how you like this," she muttered, hurling the mixture at the creature. The vial shattered against the beast's side, and the reaction was immediate. The creature let out a deafening roar, its movements becoming erratic as it thrashed wildly. The pheromones had triggered a defensive response, confusing its senses and throwing it into disarray. James seized the opportunity, driving his spear into the creature's vulnerable underbelly. The beast howled in pain, its glowing eyes flickering as it stumbled back. Ciri joined him, wielding a sharp rock she had picked up along the way. Together, they struck again and again, their attacks precise and unrelenting. Finally, with a guttural roar, the creature collapsed, its massive body hitting the ground with a thunderous crash. The jungle fell silent, the only sounds their ragged breathing and the crackle of energy dissipating from the creature's horns. James sank to his knees, his spear clattering to the ground. "Is it dead?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Ciri approached the beast cautiously, her heart pounding. She placed a hand on its side, feeling the faint tremor of its final breaths. "It's done," she said softly, her voice tinged with both relief and sorrow. Despite everything, the creature had been a part of this world, a force of nature that they had been forced to confront. As they stood over the fallen beast, the jungle began to shift. The trees parted, and a beam of light descended from the sky, illuminating them both. The voice returned, its tone no longer menacing but almost approving. "You have proven yourselves," it said, the words resonating in their minds. "Adaptation, resilience, unity. These are the qualities that define your kind. You are not merely survivors. You are conquerors." The light grew brighter, enveloping them in its warmth. For a moment, James and Ciri felt weightless, as if the planet itself were lifting them up. When the light faded, they found themselves standing in a vast, open field, the jungle and its horrors nowhere in sight. In the distance, a sleek spacecraft stood waiting, its engines humming softly. James stared at it, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "Is this real?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ciri smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up her face. "I think we just earned our ticket out of here." As they approached the ship, the voice spoke one final time. "Carry what you have learned beyond this place. The galaxy is vast, and its challenges are many. But you are human. And humans endure." James and Ciri stepped aboard the spacecraft, their hearts heavy with the weight of their journey but filled with a newfound sense of purpose. They had faced Deathworld Prime and emerged victorious, not just as survivors but as something more, proof that even in the face of unimaginable odds, humanity's spirit could not be broken. As the ship's engines roared to life and they left the planet behind, James turned to Ciri, a small grin playing at the corners of his lips. "So," he said, his tone light despite everything, "what's next?" Ciri chuckled, the sound full of hope. "Whatever it is," she said, "we'll face it together."